TPR.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the TPR Pod. Today's episode is with Dr. Umair Javed. We have finally convinced a person with a PhD to come on the show. Umair is an assistant professor of politics and sociology at LUMS in Pakistan in Lahore. We got him on to talk about, as you've seen from the title, probably Pakistan, how things have been and how things have come to be the way they are. We usually don't delve into these sort of economics, politics sort of areas, but given that this is such a huge milestone and things are not great, I thought it worthwhile to get somebody on the show who knows what he's talking about, which is very important, and just to dive into some of the reasons why things are the way they are, and especially in this episode, how have things changed from the beginning of the country's history to date, and what are some of the reasons that have caused those changes? Just to bring some more clarity, some more actual data to the discourse rather than the feelings and emotions that we all seem to rely on. Because I think this is a theme worth following, where we can separate ourselves from the politics of it all and just talk about real, actual data points and how things are changing or not changing or getting better, or as is more common, getting much worse. Umair has written 800,000 articles for Dawn, it seems. And so I've linked to two articles and his bibliography in the description and his Twitter. But before all that, without further ado, let's jump into episode 160 with Umair Javed.
हाँ, I think it was the AirPods. उसकी वजह है कि ये AirPods जो हैं ये almost exclusively सिर्फ एक काम के लिए इस्तेमाल होते हैं, वो है exercise के लिए.
अच्छा.
So इसमें accumulated years of sweat जो है वो काफी ज़्यादा खुल चुकी हुई होगी अब तक.
हाँ, I think this is a great start for our discussion on Pakistan. Accumulated years of sweat.
ठीक है.
अच्छा. Okay, yeah, because it was being recorded ना, तो वही मैं कह रहा था कि because the problem with like this hardware sort of shit is कि you have to like unplug and then replug everything एक एक करके just to see what the fault is. But this seems fine.
Alright, cool.
Yeah, so मैं सोच रहा था we started off planning for this episode कहीं और से बिल्कुल. Like I was getting in touch with you for like I think climate change mitigation steps in the urban space.
Yeah.
Or like मुझे नहीं आता. Talk to someone else.
Yeah.
And then it was education, which I'm fully invested because हुआ ये है कि because we're extremely online on Twitter. And आजकल क्या पिछले 3-4 years से there's been so much discussion on hashtag problems of Pakistan.
Yeah.
And it all seems like there's no like factual evidence ever being used. It's all feelings. There's a lot of feelings, which makes sense. I mean, it's common everywhere. So I've, in an effort to make this podcast even more niche and unrelatable, मैंने कहा कि I'm going to do the factual and empirical sort of discussions. So, and here you are.
Zindabad.
So yeah.
Very happy to.
Does that make sense? Like
yeah, it makes perfect sense. Yeah. I mean, I think it's I think any discussion where you can substantiate the general vibes online is worthwhile. It's a worthwhile endeavor in any case. So yeah, so happy to contribute to it in any way I can.
So I suppose. So then we were talking about education because you are in the field of education. Yeah. But then you had this idea which was tied to your extensive writing and research work, which was how things have changed in Pakistan. If I haven't explained in the intro, this month of August, we're going to be doing some Pakistan-focused discussions because it's been 75 years and things are amazing. So I thought we'd just do like a recap of how and why and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So we could start by talking about who you are, why you're here. Yeah.
So in case it wasn't apparent from the title of the podcast, my name is Umair Javed. I am a teacher. I teach sociology and development studies at the Lahore University of Management Sciences.
Yeah.
Or LUMSU, as it's commonly known.
Is LUMSU still a thing?
No, it's not. It was a thing for like maybe 6 hours, and then because it became like a meme on the internet. I think the higher ups at the university decided that they don't like being made fun of, so so they decided to revert back. But I'm so basically I teach sociology and I teach political economy. So essentially, just looking at how politics and the economy and larger sort of social structures interact with one another. I teach undergrads. I've been doing this full time for about 4 years, and then I used to do it as a part-time adjunct faculty member before that as well for a couple of years. Usse pehle, I've grown up in Lahore. I've basically lived pretty much my entire life in Pakistan, in Lahore, mostly a couple of years in Islamabad, and then the years I spent abroad for grad school. So I did my master's and PhD in the UK, so that's where I...
doctor.
So I spent about 4 years in the UK. So I did my undergrad in economics and politics at LUMS. Then I did a master's in politics at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. And then I did my PhD in sociology at the London School of Economics. So I got done in 2018. So that's the CV. I guess that's what I do to make a living and survive in this high inflation environment. But more generally, as an online person, I'm a very online person. Much like yourself, I've basically been writing on and off about things that interest me for the better part of about 10, 11 years. Now, I started off with a blog. That blog is thankfully kept under lock and key now. It's not easily accessible. So the blog was called Recycled Thought, very edgy name for a 22-year-old back in the day.
Appropriate.
And I thought that I had these great insights about, how Pakistan works, right? How Pakistani politics works, how society functions and all. And so leading to that, someone decided to give me a newspaper column, when I was 23, 24. This is again about 10 years ago. And I've been writing for Dawn pretty much since then. So it's been 10 years, and I've written mostly about politics, but occasionally there are things that are happening more broadly in Pakistan that interest me, and I feel like if I was if I were to summarize all of my writings, in one genre, or if I were to sort of categorize it, I think I've basically just been writing about social change in Pakistan for the last 10 to 12 years, right? Things that are happening which are slow moving. Or what sort of people call glacial in terms of how that transformation has taken place, but they often don't get noticed immediately, or their impact or their consequences become apparent after an extended period of time. And I think we're seeing some of those consequences, both in terms of how our politics is functioning, how society in general is behaving, and obviously a lot of those related things, right? So that's basically, I guess that's a not so brief introduction.
Why sociology and politics? Because you've been doing this for a while then, right? You didn't want to become a doctor, an accountant. Everyone loves to be an accountant.
No, my elder sister is an accountant. She's a chartered accountant. She was academically gifted. Okay. And clearly was very clear about the fact. I mean, she was very clear about the fact that she wanted to do this. But the kind of effort that she had to put in, and she was training to become an accountant. Late 90s, early 2000. So I would just see her, and I was in high school at the time, and I would just see her. I was like, no, this isn't for me. This is too much work. It's too much work. I have, I was good at some things. I was like reasonably okay at maths. I had basic language skills, and so LUMS became sort of like a default option. And once I was there, you end up in a quote unquote bad company. Bad company being those sort of left wing Marxist professors who tell you how the entire world is rigged in different ways. And very honestly and truthfully, I think they're right about a lot of things as well. And I think that had a pretty significant impact on my subsequent career trajectory. And then sort of 8-10 years down the line, I realized that I really enjoy teaching. I think the engagement with students in particular is something that I find very rewarding, and so that's how I ended up here.
Are many people teaching at LUMS ex-students of LUMS?
Yeah, it's like an assembly line of sorts. I mean, I wager that the number in our department, so in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, I'd say it's about 60%, maybe 70% are undergrads mostly. I think it's it's basically because there are only a few places in Pakistan where you could make a reasonable career out of a social science education, and teaching is obviously one of those things, and LUMS being one of those few places where you can do that. So I think that explains it.
You were talking about the things that are so slow moving that they don't catch immediate public attention, and it's hard for that attention to be also sustained, which I've been thinking about that not in terms of Pakistan as such, but really in terms of climate change, which has been discussed for decades, and everything we do has to be like a really concise but cutting sort of tweet. So I was trying to formulate something on that, on how humanity has really failed on really coming to grips with it, because shit's up in the air now. But it's not like any of this was not repeatedly predicted, mentioned, any of this. And then that sort of does tie into, like, I guess, Pakistan as well, because it seems like there is people are sort of geared towards reacting only to what's really in front of them and super visible and pressing. But bade masle jo hain, they'll fade out.
I think ek to the tyranny of the news cycle, I think, dominates pretty much every society now, and Pakistan. I don't even think it's a tyranny of the news cycle anymore. I think it's the tyranny of the timeline or whatever is on sort of social your feed, social media feed. So I think it's I think that really sort of it sort of, I mean, it limits the amount of attention that people will give to certain types of issues.
Right.
But I think a lot of the slow-moving things, so climate change is a catastrophe that we're sort of hurtling towards and have been for the better part of about 70, 80 years, maybe, slightly more than that. But then there are a lot of other things that are, I would say, like value neutral, right? Those things that are sort of slow-moving in nature. So like urbanization, that I think we'll plausibly talk about in a bit, but things that are changing, we're not really sure what the consequences of that change is going to be. But it is happening, right? And it's not something that people will discuss because it's not politics, it's not immediately affecting their day-to-day lives. But over maybe 10, 20, 30, 40 years, it'll have profound impacts on the way that the country functions. So I think we're all sort of pehle news cycle tha, now it's basically the timeline or the feed or whatever it is that you're sort of scrolling through. I think that's how our attentions tend to get.
Because you've been writing about this for, you said, 10, 15 years. That is also the time within which social media sort of emerged and then became this mind-shaping sort of machine. Have you noticed a change in people's perceptions, attention spans, priorities in that period? Because everybody's also like stopped reading newspapers, for example.
For sure.
And, news has come on social media. And I talked to Zarar about this, about how, I keep asking him, why are Pakistani politicians on Twitter so much? Because there aren't that many Pakistanis on Twitter. So who are these tweets for? And then it's also where those tweets are for, the impression that they create. But then the impression created on Twitter starts ending up affecting the actual politics itself. Like that cycle goes in reverse. Have you seen that in your...
I think for sure. I mean, it's, I started off writing and sort of my social media sort of trajectory, sort of they're co-eval. They started happening at the same time. And I think in the earlier sort of years when obviously you had, the numbers were smaller, there was discussion, and you could feel as if you were to send out a tweet or you were to share an article, it would sort of maybe be read by a few people, and that was pretty much it. Then came a time when you felt that your reach was growing, and so maybe 2013 to 2015, I felt that was that period when people were actively consuming news through social media.
Arab Spring sort of period also?
Yeah, so just post Arab Spring in Pakistan, the rise of Imran Khan, the 2013 election, the Dharna, all of that is when sort of the news cycle was very heavily linked to what was happening on social media. And then I think what we have after that is sort of mass fragmentation. So I basically just social media being in and of itself the basic source of news, the basic source of discourse. Everything else is then secondary. So no one's interested. And I know this like completely. I think no one is interested in reading 800 words or 900 words on any topic unless they're occupationally invested in it in some form or the other. And I think everyone who's ever writing anything that's longer than a tweet thread should be aware of the fact that you're writing for a very niche audience. It's not there's no mass reach that exists out there, especially in a country like Pakistan, where at least English language news media, though in any case, never really took off in the same way. And Urdu is now just consumed more directly through the visual medium, news channels, YouTube videos, and so on.
Yeah. Okay. So then coming to Pakistan, then 75 years. Things are not great. They haven't been great for a while, and perhaps not for the reasons that are talked about in the news in a big way. Like, sure, there's the financial crisis, and democracy is always in threat. And as my dad says, Islam 1400 saal se khatre mein hai. Somehow that never changes. So that's all there. But we were talking to, there's this person you also might know, Aisha, on Twitter. She's big in the urban planning space, and she has a farm. There's an episode. Pakistan is changing in terms of where Pakistanis live, where they can make money, what money-making options and, making a living options sort of exist for people. But how do you have like an image of what Pakistan was like at the start?
Sure. I mean, there's this. So as far as images and visuals are concerned, there are these borderline Orientalist / racist videos that the British Film Institute uploaded a while back about life in the subcontinent during the 1940s and 1950s. And they're very heavily, sort of, I guess, shaped and influenced by Joseph Fakki anthropology and this idea of village life. But there is a kernel of truth to it, right? I mean, if we were to say that there is such a thing as a median Pakistani or an average Pakistani, the average Pakistani was rural, was engaged in farm work. So back in 1951, which is when the first census happened in Pakistan after independence, about 17% of the population lived in areas that were classified as urban. We're talking about towns. 17. Okay. So towns and cities and so places like Lahore, Karachi, and so on. And even that was largely because of the influx of post-partition refugees, right? So this is actually pretty mind-blowing statistic that in the city of Lahore in 1951, 43% of the population of that city was actually a migrant from India. Right. So just within the city itself, 43%. Karachi it was about 55%. But Faisalabad, which is not something that you think about, or is not a place that there are very few reasons to think about Faisalabad. But no offense to Faisalabad.
Recently, there is a reason on Twitter to think about Faisalabad.
The father, whatever that executive name is, but for me, the Faisalabad statistic is actually is mind blowing. But 70% of Faisalabad's population came from what is now India. Okay, wow. So this is in 1951, right? And so whatever urban population that did exist was majority, or if not more, slightly more than the majority, was all partition migrants.
Right.
But the vast majority of the country, about 83% of the country, lived in rural areas. Right? They lived in places that were classified as villages. They did farm-related work. And so if you take this forward by another 10, 12 years, so 1963, about 61% of the working population in the country actually was directly engaged in agriculture. So they were working on farms. That's the statistic that we have. I guess that really demonstrates that Pakistan was by and large a rural country. Most people, did not have access to education, healthcare. Most people did not have access to metal roads. They did not have access to, attached washrooms or toilet facilities in general. And so I think that's the baseline that we're essentially working from in 75 years since.
Yeah, and that is completely different to, I think there's also something a few years ago, what happened was, again on Twitter, somebody put out this report or the summary of something put out by the Pakistani Bureau of Statistics, which said something about, what the income brackets of Pakistan are.
Sure.
And there was something that said ki if your annual income is like 14 lakh se upar, right, of your household, which is effectively like 120,000 per month, then you are above 95% of the Pakistani population.
Oh yeah, for sure.
In 18, 19. And
Yeah,
things have not gotten better since,
Yeah.
which I found to be such a insanely mind-blowing statistic.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the people on Twitter and the people
sure.
who go to, LUMS type universities or city
Yeah,
school
for
even,
sure.
that is like a minuscule amount in today's age, right? You can't have rent plus 2 kids who go to school and all of that. That money is just not enough.
Yeah.
But if you ask people on the street or whatever in urban areas in Pakistan, are you rich? They say no.
Yeah.
100% not. So there's a huge perception gap in what Pakistan is and how many people are actually, I think, in the country.
I mean, it's a country of 220 million people, right? And how is it that when you...
It's a figure perhaps too big for people to...
Too big, exactly. And we can't compute it, right? We can't understand it. And how is it that when, and you hear these things like, when people, mostly from the 1% or, or like the upper 2%, they talk about things like, Karachi is so small, or you keep running into people from Karachi everywhere, like Lahore is so small, you keep running into people. We've all said it, right?
Yeah.
And you're like, well, maybe that's because the 1% isn't that big. It's a city, it's a country still is 220 million people. There are 11 million people who live in Lahore, according to the 2017 census. I'm pretty sure I don't know like 99.9% of that population, right? And I keep running into the 0.1% that I went to college with, went to school with, the people I see in spaces that I frequent on a regular basis, right? So I think the scale of the country, which and actually this ties back to something you said earlier about like people not being optimistic about where the country is heading, or people thinking that things aren't great, and 75 years we really don't have much to show for. I think this works both ways. That if you take the same idea of what was sort of the average Pakistani or the median Pakistani's life, in 1951 or in 1947, and the median Pakistani's life in 2022, I think they're both quite drastically different from what the upper class Pakistani's life is like in 1947 and in 2022. Okay. So I think it's that's why it's hard to make very clear-cut adjudications about the fact that have we regressed? Maybe we haven't regressed in some metrics, maybe we have in others. I just think that the country is so large and it's obviously the fifth, sixth most populated country in the world, that it's hard to come up with one story that fits for the entire country.
Right. Achha, so we have a picture then of the 50s, the early 50s and the 60s of most of the country, like a huge majority of the country not being urban. And jo urban hain bhi, a huge majority of them are migrants from India.
Yeah.
So let's jump all the way forward. How do things look now?
So now it's a completely different context altogether, right? So in 2017, the official population for the official urban population as a percentage of the total population was around 37%.
Oh, sure.
So it's about 20% higher than what it was back in 1951. But there's severe undercounting happening because the criteria, what we use to define urban, is an administrative criteria. Right. So essentially what we're saying is that if a particular place is labeled as urban, its population will be counted as urban. Everything else that may look like a city, walks like a city, talks like a city, but isn't officially categorized as a city, uski population jo urban nahi count hogi. Right. So it's a purely arbitrary, babu-ridden sort of criteria that we've developed.
Is there funding attached to this?
There's a politics to it. So if a place is declared urban, it has to pay property tax. So that's one of the reasons why people are reluctant to classify new places as urban, because there's obviously people don't want to pay tax and they don't want to get rated as an urban area. But iske alawa, it's just also inertia. It's just bureaucratic sort of I guess the way that these things have been happening since 1981. So this criteria was used in 81 for the first time, and it's pretty much been in place since. Okay. But there's a researcher based in Lahore called Raza Ali. He works on urban related issues. He estimates that it could be as high as 50%. So Pakistan's population is, if we just go by urban characteristics, having access to better roads, having access to education centers, having access to healthcare, being very close to areas where agriculture is not the main form of employment, that percentage of the population could be as high as 50 to 60%.
And this is also taking into account how much the population has grown since.
Exactly.
Right.
So just the absolute numbers mein to baat kare to we're like, there are more people living in urban areas now in Pakistan than there were people in Pakistan in 1951. Yeah.
Okay, and we'll come to whether this is a good thing or not. But why has this happened? But this obviously means there are some forces causing these changes.
Sure.
Economic, industrial, whatever.
Yeah.
Why is this happening? Why is this a trend in Pakistan?
So there are two sort of broad reasons that are given. One is that people are being pushed off land. Land is simply unproductive as a source of sustaining yourself. I'm sure Aisha actually did talk about this, in her podcast as well. Which is simply that, as each generation sort of, as you pass through generations, land gets fragmented because of intergenerational, wealth transfer.
Yeah.
So, parcels of land get smaller. It's harder to sustain agriculture on smaller parcels of land. So eventually you'll have one brother, two brothers, moving off into the city and so on. So that's one reason. The second is that simply because agriculture prices are normally kept low the world over, agriculture is not a particularly lucrative profession to be in unless you have a large amount of land. So people are so people are more likely to go towards cities where you can get employment that is better remunerated, that offers you a slightly greater chance of upward social mobility. And then there's the idea aspect of it, right? Like, people have always been fascinated by urban life. They they want access to, because urban centers are where where consumption happens, right? It's where people sort of have those fancy glittery things which have, and that's been true for pretty much every society, I guess, over the last 200 years. And so I think that has its own appeal. And so people sort of move, and people move for all sorts of reasons. Move because of natural calamities, earthquakes, for example, floods. People move because of war. A lot of urbanization in Pakistan is driven by conflict-related displacement. So you have war in the northwest, which has been sort of pretty much going on nonstop for 4 decades, and that's resulted in a large transfer of population from border districts to first the Peshawar Valley, then further down south to places like Lahore and obviously to Karachi. So all of those reasons are also, they're contributing towards urbanization.
Yeah, and then obviously this means that there is a drain on your. I don't know if it would be a drain. It might also be that the rural sort of aspect of the country sustains itself. It just doesn't need that many people, and it's the excess people, so to speak, who are moving to cities. It might be that the rural population, the rural side of the country, is losing that human resource. But then there is the additional people who are moving into cities more and more over time, which means you need resources, you need infrastructure, which may or may not be keeping up. I think in Karachi's case, we can say it's not keeping up.
Yeah.
But does this tie into your article where you were talking about the dietary consumption habits of Pakistan?
Yeah, I mean, so food is something that's probably the only thing that I am genuinely passionate about, in the sense that if there's a way that I could convert it into my actual occupation. And so I was interested in finding out more about, like, what did people consume as far as, their sort of, maybe it's an identity crisis of sorts on my end. But I was interested to know, what was the Umair equivalent consuming 2 generations ago or 3 generations ago? What was an average menu in a household actually look like? What were they eating, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the sources of information are these old gazetteers that colonial era officials used to draw up, where they would basically document, in their view, what like sort of village life was actually like. Yeah. And the most stark finding for me was that the Punjabi peasants' diet, so Punjabi peasantry being my ancestors, were largely the diet was largely gluten-free and vegetarian. Okay? So wheat was not a staple crop in Punjab in the turn of the 19th, early 20th century. It only became it became a staple export crop under colonialism, mostly in the 1910s and 1920s, tied to the First World War and then the Second World War.
Sure.
And so most people were consuming bajra and jowar, sorghum and barley and gram flour or besan. So that was what constituted the grain part of the diet as far as our ancestors were concerned. And then a lot of it was supplemented by fresh fruits, vegetables mostly leafy greens that were commonly found in Punjab and all the way down the Indus Tract into Sindh as well. And then other than that, meat was hardly consumed. It was consumed mostly by upper class households,
right?
Not by the sort of, the average farmer, the average cultivator. And so there's this great anecdote that I keep returning to, and it was there in my column as well, when the Pakistani travel writer Musansir Hussain Tard he talks about his uncle who moves to the city for the first time as a 40-year-old in the 1940s or the 1950s.
Yeah.
And that's the first time he has a chicken ka salan, like a gravy, right? And he gets violently sick and ends up in the hospital because the gravy is something that gravy, that sort of quintessential Pakistani, what we associate as Pakistani food, right? The tomato, onion, ginger, garlic based sort of curry that we have. Was something that was completely alien to him. He had never had it. And we're not talking about someone who's like, who's in the middle of the sort of, desert, or like he's not like one of those sort of indigenous person tribe, that's been sent to the city. We're talking about someone who grew up in the Punjabi countryside, possibly an hour and a half away from an urban center. But that was just something that was missing in their diet, right? So that's one drastic change that's happened over 100 years. Yeah. But if we talk about like a slightly more compressed time period, say the last 20 years or so, that's where I would classify as what we've seen as the fast food revolution, right? The fast food revolution is, and if there's one product, there are two products that actually encapsulate the fast food revolution in Pakistan. Yeah. The first is the shawarma. Yeah. And the second is the fried chicken burger or the zinger, right? Yeah. And this is something that you will find, and then a pizza becomes sort of, I guess, the third one that you'll find. I was going to say, yeah. So these are the things that you will find now in pretty much every settlement across Pakistan that has a population of more than, say, maybe 5,000 people will have at least one of these three things available as fast food. And I think that is a function of urbanization. That's a function of greater connectivity between urban and rural centers. It's also a function of Gulf migration and the sort of slow but obviously very pervasive influence that international migration has on rural areas across the country. And obviously the big change over the last 10 years has been the penetration of mobile broadband internet. Right? Yeah. So all of that is now fully visible in view of a large population. Yeah. And I think that's what shapes these dietary changes. I mean, I just have sort of on this, the last thing that I want to sort of add to this, like one data point that I find really interesting is that back in 2010, there's this 2012 actually, there's this Lahore-based fast food chain called Cock and Bull. I don't know if you've ever had the privilege of having them. I've heard. They make these shawarmas or the items that resemble shawarmas. They advertised for district level franchises in 20 small cities across Pakistan, right? This is back in 2012. They were looking to franchise their shawarma across 20 different cities. Like we're talking about Sahiwal, Sargodha, DG Khan, all of these places which if you're grown up in a big city in Pakistan, you think of these places as like backwaters. Like you think of these places as rural in nature, but they're not. They're sort of, they're just smaller versions. They're smaller centers, urban centers, but they have a lot of these same sort of features that we now associate with big cities in any case.
Yeah. Oh shit. I mean, Pakistan mein ye bhi hai na ki it's like when I went to I went to China for work and sab keh rahe the ki there's a city called Dalian and sab keh it's a tiny city, very small city. 4 million people live there. I was like, a tiny city. Yeah. And I live in Ireland. Jahan puri population of the whole country is like 5.5 million. 6 million. Yeah. So that really small is really relative to the country you're in.
Sure. But it completely is.
So coming back to the meat consumption thing. Meat consumption in Pakistan is now, I was watching, there's this YouTube channel, Best Ever Food Review Show. They finally came to Pakistan.
Yeah.
And all they ate in Lahore and Islamabad was meat. There was a lot of chicken, a lot of lamb, like various, exotic cuts and items. Then they went to, I think, Hunza. And Hunza mein very minimal meat consumption. There's dairy consumption, but not meat. So has the diet of the rural Punjabi person changed also? Or is it
for sure.
Yeah.
We have numbers on this, right? So we have we can see what percentage of households are spending on what percentage of their household budget is being spent on fruits and vegetables, right. And what's being spent on meat. And it's still the relationship still holds as it has held for 100 years. That as you go up the income ladder, your meat consumption goes up, both in terms of the actual quantity, but also in terms of the percentage of your food budget that you're willing to spend on eating out as well as on meat consumption. But numbers have grown across the income income distribution in Pakistan. So people are consuming more, and the reason for that is partly obviously because of just growth in livestock numbers. It's cheaper than ever to maintain livestock, and most rural households will have some source of livestock. So they'll have a dairy animal, which after it stops producing milk will be used for meat consumption eventually. And the other is the broiler revolution in Pakistan, right? The chicken broiler revolution, right? Which has just transformed how protein intake actually happens in a poor country. So the broiler revolution, which happens around the 1960s and 70s, made this item which we call a chicken. It's not, I mean, I don't know, it's barely anything. It's like a 42-day challenge, right? It's a 42-day challenge to grow this living thing, and then just sort of, and then obviously
is it just
use it
like 42-ish days.
Apparently it's like the average lifespan of a broiler is 40 days from egg to fully formed chicken. And
a broiler is a type of chicken.
Yeah, broiler being the white chicken, the murgi, the sort of kukri that most people tend to consume here, especially in urban centers. So that's changed our dietary patterns considerably. But even today, if you go to rural area and if you go to like a sort of a lower income household in rural areas, meat consumption is still like a once a week feature.
Is it a cost that's the issue?
Yeah, it's the costs, the trade-off associated with. I mean, here we go and buy livestock to consume, right? They grow. I mean, they rear livestock to sell it, right? So for them, it's an actual trade-off, right? Whether you want to sell chicken or you want to eat this chicken that you're selling, right? Yeah, exactly. So वो भी एक है factor उसमें, but those things have changed.
The increase in meat consumption, apart from sort of more efficient procedures like 42-day challenge, if there's been a huge increase in meat consumption, that means there's a huge increase in meat production and livestock rearing.
Sure.
Which then means that has its own impact on the land itself, because now again I'm on that climate change sort of bent where, apart from the emissions from livestock rearing, there's also all those animals have to eat something, which means that you have to grow something for them to eat. In Pakistan, has there been any like messaging on limitations of, like now it's like, you should eat less meat because it's bad for the climate, but also we don't have a lot of money to throw around. We never have had money. So has there been any sort of resource-based messaging on this?
I mean, we're still pretty sort of. I mean, if you were to, I know so globally, though we're all pretty much screwed. But if you look at just the level of per capita meat consumption in Pakistan, it's very low compared to like the average Pakistani is still consuming less meat than the average American was in the early to mid 19th century, right? And we're certainly our footprint, our ecological footprint, as far as meat consumption is concerned, is quite low. But there are other farming practices, for example, our use of water, which includes using water to grow grain, which is used as livestock feed, which is a problem, and it's a problem that everyone has talked about. And there are occasional efforts to get that messaging across, but no one's been able to crack just how to sort of resolve that particular issue. There's also just the fact that there are fewer people now working in agriculture than there ever were, in Pakistan's history, right? So it's that a lot of the ecological damage that we see is actually happening in industries that are outside of agriculture, which is where the majority of the population now actually works.
Okay. Then there's the big migration we were talking about from rural to urban. Are we seeing, like, is it working out for people who are moving to cities, or are they just moving to cities to be poor? Because
that's the big question, right? I think I think jury's out to a large extent, but I think what we're basically seeing is that people are that's very difficult. That even making like if you're an asset poor household, moving from a rural area to an urban area,
what does asset poor
making
mean?
it asset poor meaning that you don't have a lot of generational wealth, you don't have land, for example, you don't own any assets like livestock or land or anything of that sort. Moving to an urban area, making it is difficult. You're and a large part. Okay, so here's an easier way of thinking about it. So पहले 18% लोग रहते थे रूरल एरियाज में, अब 37% और up to 50% रहते हैं. पहले 60% लोग एग्रीकल्चर में काम करते थे, अब को about 35-36% करते हैं. What are the rest doing? So the sectors that have absorbed the greatest amount of labor are wholesale and retail trade. So like shopkeeping, essentially small scale businesses, construction work. So working as day laborers, which is predominantly where most poor rural migrants actually end up being, end up finding work. Manufacturing, to a certain extent, about 15% of Pakistan's population works in manufacturing. So factory jobs, which are usually better paying, have greater benefits associated with them, they're not available to everyone.
Sure.
And then the rest are like really low, what we sort of quote unquote call low skilled labor, right? Which is essentially a lot of time intensive labor, such as, working as domestic help and working as cleaners or things like that. So a lot of that is where most rural migrants end up being. And these aren't stable jobs. They don't offer, retirement benefits. They don't offer other sort of health insurance or any of those sort of benefits that are associated with urban employment in general. And so it's not, they don't really offer like a great pathway towards what we call social mobility. It's not like you move to the city and now your family in a couple of generations is going to make it. It's not as clear cut. But then you have to imagine how bad things are going to be in those rural areas that people are still feel compelled that they have to move to a city.
Has Pakistan's because you were saying factory workers and construction workers, now construction has been an enormous source of economic investment and gain in the past, I would say 20-30 years, since the major projects, the barrier towns, etc., they've sort of emerged. And so many people have gotten so rich in Pakistan that the math does not make sense, but
exactly.
Chal raha. Factory workers, factories, industries, etc., I feel, based on my not having any research, I feel that this is a quickly declining sort of field, a part of Pakistan's economy as compared to where perhaps things were 50 years ago. How has Pakistan's economy and the revenue contributors to the country, how has that mix-up changed over our life?
So manufacturing has stayed stagnant. So if you basically were to look at, we hit about, I think, 15% in terms of our total GDP. Manufacturing as a percentage of GDP was about 15% 40-50 years ago. We're sort of maybe a few percentage points above that. So we're like 18-19% now. And so there hasn't been this large scale transformation towards just Pakistan becoming like a hub of factories where people are just building things and ideally exporting them. That's not happening, right? And but the other thing that's changed is the nature of jobs within those factories has also deteriorated. So pehle, up till the 1960s and 70s, if you were a factory laborer, you worked in a paper mill or a textile mill or whatever, you had stable employment, most likely a pension plan, health insurance, and you had a number of other labor protections, right? Now what happens is that factories hire people as subcontractors. So they hire subcontractors, they ask them to bring in 200 laborers who work either on a daily wage rate or a monthly or a piece rate, so number of items produced rate. And so none of the labor protections apply to them. And so even within the manufacturing sector, which has historically been a source of good upward social mobility in the 1930s, 40s across other parts of the world, and in obviously China, that simply doesn't exist, right? So and where do sort of people then end up going? They work in construction, like you said. There's been a construction boom in Pakistan over the last 3 decades. In the 1960s, about 1% of Pakistan's labor force used to work in construction. Now it's 9%. So it's actually gone up by, you can do the math, but it's it's almost 5 times greater than what it was, 40, 50 years ago. So construction is the second biggest employer in Lahore, in Karachi, and most other big cities in Pakistan. and construction jobs are terrible. Like they're seasonal. कि जब project चल रहा है वो चल रहा है, जब नहीं चल रहा वो नहीं चल रहा. And so that's how the economy, and as far as contributing towards the larger economy is concerned, whether this is helping Pakistan's development, it obviously isn't. Construction से taxes बहुत कम receive होते हैं. उसी तरह जो है construction की जो jobs हैं वो relatively low productivity हैं. Construction आप export नहीं कर सकते. So you can't earn dollars with construction. That's at least you can't earn them in any meaningful way. So I think those are some of the ways in which the economy has transformed, especially these past few decades.
Would we know why these changes are happening? Like, why has the rate of industrial growth not been as great? I mean, that's, I guess, the question, right? Pakistan, China क्यों नहीं बना? Pakistan, India क्यों नहीं? Pakistan, Vietnam क्यों नहीं बना, for example?
Vietnam actually is the better comparison. Vietnam and increasingly Bangladesh. I mean, we have like a whole bunch of like cookie cutter reasons. People say the bad policy choices. We, artificially suppress the dollar. We create these arbitrary distinctions between what kind of goods you can import, what you can't import. There's a lot of uncertainty as far as electricity tariff rates are concerned. We tend to tax manufacturing businesses a lot compared to, say, we don't tax traders and we don't tax construction and real estate work as much.
Right.
So all of these and these are all valuable and plausible reasons, and I think that's certainly part of it. I think the one thing that I would add to it is that Pakistan has simply not had like a developmental vision. And by Pakistan, I mean the Pakistani state elite or the Pakistani sort of, policymakers, politicians, the military establishment. We just haven't had a developmental vision of what this economy is supposed to do, right? Is it supposed to industrialize? If you're supposed to industrialize, then that's the idea that you bring to the people, right? That this is the most important thing that we now have to do. Everyone has to play their part in doing this. This is what happened in Korea. This is what happened in China. This is what happened in Vietnam. It's what happened in the Soviet Union in the early 20th century. It's what happened in France in the 19th century. Basically, you need to have an idea of why you're doing this, right? Right now, the great Pakistani economic idea is, we need to go to the IMF because we're going to default and then everything's going to go belly up. And that's why we have to raise petrol prices. Iske baad kya hoga? Like, I mean, what is the broader sort of, standard of living ideology or standard of living idea that you're actually selling to people, right? The great idea that currently sort of dominates in Pakistani urban centers is आप migrate कर जाओ, right? I mean, so basically Pakistan का great developmental idea है कि पाकिस्तान छोड़ दो. So आप basically, I mean,
which is really like this. If you think about it, it's this like blanket aura of like hopelessness. इस मुल्क में तो कुछ नहीं, like nothing's gonna happen in Pakistan. The best thing you can do for yourself is leave and stay away. Don't even like, there's not even like come back unless you're like a PTI supporting doctor in the US. वो उसके अलावा you're
वो
not,
भी नहीं आया.
So we have studiously not been very political on this podcast because we're a bunch of idiots. But then if you're talking about like why are things the way they are, how much of the blame, let's make this as like neutral as possible, how much of the blame of Pakistan's not becoming the great Islamic, Muslim, South Asian, whatever industrial superpower, tiger Korea learned from us, that sort of thing, how much of that can be blamed on failures of leadership? I would say all of it, but
I mean, so I think partly it's because of the kind of academic training that I have, that I tend to, that I'm a little more hesitant in ascribing blame to individuals. I think there are, again, larger processes that contribute to certain types of outcomes, and I think Pakistan has also not been particularly lucky when it comes to sort of, again, the region, the kind of sort of the geopolitics of where we are. And I think lots of and then obviously lots of bad choices being taken by leaders, and those leaders are representatives of particular socioeconomic groups within society at large, right?
Yes.
So, or they're representatives of certain institutions within this country. So I think that really is, so if for example, Pakistan failed to produce a viable and competitive agricultural base, it was largely because large landlords prefer to extract rents of poor laborers rather than innovating and selling their product into the market. They would much prefer having a protected agricultural market in this country that allows them, that gives them a minimum support price on wheat, on sugar, and they can sort of make money off it. Similarly, industrialists, that are working in any number of sectors prefer to be shielded from competition. They lobby the government, they lobby decision makers. They threaten them by sort of, that they'll sort of take their money out of the country. They threaten them by saying that we'll, close down our factories, and they get their way around it. So so I think the failure is largely that, like any country, the Pakistani state is under a lot of pressure from competing interests, and it's just sort of, given into those interests at various points.
But then you would argue that that's where the failure occurred. That these pressures exist everywhere.
But on pressures को balance out करने के लिए usually आपके पास कुछ होता है, right? So, and that's the failure of democracy in Pakistan, right? That's the biggest. So the failure of democracy is not just that you don't have representative voice and people don't get a say in how things are run, but the failure of democracy is that in those trade-offs, where there's where between sort of the protected rent-seeking state or the landlord or the military establishment versus the average citizen who might be able to gain more if this economy was more competitive and if obviously things had been taken differently, it's that guy who's losing out, right? It's that person who's losing out. So, and that's largely a failure of decision making that is not responsive to the interests of the majority. So I think that's the political economy aspect or angle to why things haven't happened the way they have. Another explanation could just be that we've had like a string of idiots who've run the country,
which is also true. It's not even that they're necessarily perhaps idiots. I think that वो वाली बात ज़्यादा होगी ना कि their interests are not representative of the masses, quote unquote.
Exactly.
And also, I feel the lack of stability in democracy being a thing in Pakistan also really keeps everybody's goals or aspirations like short term. Where they're like, पता नहीं कल ये हो भी या ना हो, तो जितनी जल्दी अपना काम कर सकते हो करो, and then just have like an exit strategy in your pocket. I don't know if that's true or not. My conspiracies. Have things. So there was the South Korea thing that just reminded me. Once upon a time, Pakistan was Asian tiger tha bhai, oh zabardast.
Sure.
And, tigers are a big part of our political discussions. Was this true? And why did we stop? Would you know?
So, I mean, it's true to the extent that. Here's the way of thinking about it. Imagine you have 0 factories, right? And then you build the first factory.
Yeah.
Okay. So infinite change आ गया ये तो. ठीक है. फिर एक आपके पास पहले एक फैक्ट्री थी, फिर आपने उसको 2 फैक्ट्रीज बना दिया, right? So that you've doubled the industrialization rate of the country.
Right.
So think of like the 1960s as that.
Right.
Like Pakistan started off with like a really bad like a really low baseline.
Yeah.
And we were able to build some infrastructure and some obviously like an economic base, both in agriculture and industry during the 1960s. And a lot of other countries were doing the same. So Korea was doing this in the 1950s and 60s as well. Pakistan was doing it, right? And then basically, then we end up on different trajectories. Now, but some of the reasons are so to answer your question, yes, it is true that Pakistan's trajectory was somewhat similar to other quote unquote Asian tigers or late developers, late developers, but then the trajectories fall off mostly around the 1970s onwards, and there are a whole number of explanations that would be very boring to get into at this point, but it's safe to say that that the particular configuration of politics in Pakistan along with international factors combined just didn't work in our favor as far as the economy was concerned. Whereas for Korea, Korea had political, economic, and despite being in a perpetual state of war with their neighbor, geostrategic stability that ended up sort of ensuring, the kind of country that it is today. Same goes for Thailand, same to a large extent for Vietnam following the 1970s and so on.
Yeah, because like the war ended and the war was horrible. And chalo for Korea, just still at war with North Korea technically. But like internally, they haven't had huge upheavals. So there's this one back burner conflict ongoing, but they can focus on what's happening. Whereas Pakistan,
and they have protection, right? They have like perennial protection from that neighbor. With the American presence in the region and with their relationship with Japan, with the way that it is, right? So I think that was so I think that's
and Pakistan's like 60s amazing growth was also because of, the one military leader all older uncles love to reminisce about,
Yeah,
Ayub Khan.
and the kind of relationship that Pakistan had with the US at that particular
Yeah.
point in time.
Yeah.
And I think that was. But there is one other thing that I would add, and I think up till the 1970s at least, even with Bhutto and all sort of, and there were decisions that he made that were that clearly had negative consequences in the long run. It was that these leaders still had developmental visions, right?
Sure,
They
yeah.
came in thinking that this is the key to salvation
Yeah.
for this country lies in some economic reconfiguration of this society, right? That I'm going to industrialize everything. Everything is going to become modern. Everything is going to be, and Bhutto came in saying everything will be for the worker and so on. I mean, there's a rhetoric. That didn't really amount to much, but
Yeah.
but that was it. From the 80s onward, we just haven't had that, right? The 80s
Yeah.
onward, it's been, this is for Islam, or this is for, whatever, Riyasat Medina, or this
Yeah.
is for democracy as a slogan, but it really doesn't sort of tie into some larger developmental idea of what a country is supposed to do, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's where, and that's how you see the trajectories also sort of in some ways.
And also, beginning of the 70s, we lost half the country.
Yeah.
All through the 80s, we're part of this war against the Soviet Union.
Sure.
And then 2000s, again, we're part of this war. When does religiosity as part of the mainstream political angle become a thing? Is it the 80s?
So,
or late 70s?
I think religiosity, and so there are two ways of thinking about it. The first is organized religious elements. So people who get together and decide that they want to shake things up in religion's name has always been a thing.
Yeah.
Prior to partition, Pakistan was partly created as a result of that.
Yeah.
And it continues up till the 1950s with the anti-MDR riots and so on.
Yeah.
So that's always been a thing. It sort of, I guess, it sort of gained ground in the 1980s, but in the late 1970s, 80s. But it remains, in that form. Then we have religiosity as far as societal practices are concerned, right? Are people becoming more orthodox in terms of their ritual practices? So the analogy that I draw here is with early 19th to mid 19th century US, where people ended up in what were sort of commonly called religious revivals, right? So you would have a preacher who would go to a particular place, and he would be an evangelical, obviously, and he would talk about how salvation lies in sort of, becoming more orthodox in the kind of rituals that you have. And so that's how Mormonism, for example, came into being. That's how a lot of the sort of, reformist faiths that we see in the US, that's when they came into being. Ye jo revivalism hai Pakistan mein, this is predominantly a phenomenon of the 80s onwards, right?
Right.
And it's intimately tied to urbanization.
Okay.
And it's intimately tied to changes in information and communication technology, right? Okay. So the great Pakistani religiosity sort of moment happens largely in the preceding 3 decades, when people are made aware of what orthodox practices in religion actually look like. Okay, what does prayer involve? What is the right way of praying, right? And obviously everything becomes a more quantified calculation of haram, halal, sawab, guna. And I think that is only possible when you have greater sources of information and greater ways of communicating with.
वरना पहले या कैसे?
Exactly. पहले तो अमेरिकन रिवाइवलिज्म जो था वो तो ये था कि लोग एक शहर से दूसरे शहर जाते थे और वहां पे बताते थे. पाकिस्तान में भी ये होता रहा है, पूरी जिंदगी होता रहा है.
Sure.
But इसको जो एक sort of जो take off मिली है, that has largely been in the post 2000s environment, right?
Okay.
And that's largely because of, and there are a couple of statistics that I think are genuinely mind-blowing in some ways, right?
Okay.
In 1998, around 10% of all households in the country got their information from television. Okay. So around 10%. Obviously, the majority of this was in urban areas, a small minority in rural areas, and there were only 2 news channels, right? So STN tha, PTV tha, uske alawa kuch nahi tha. By 2017, this figure is now up to 60%. So 60% of Pakistan's population gets its information from television. And obviously, is 60% में भी आधे जो हैं उनके पास cable news है, so they have access to 50 channels, right? The rest may still have only terrestrial sort of access and so on.
Sure.
ठीक है, that's one major source of information getting out into the country. So Alim Online as a 2003 phenomenon, Amir Liaquat, that sort of, I think, escalates all the way up till 2015. Then in 2015, you have another revolution, right? So in 1998, 0% of all households in Pakistan used to get their information from a cell phone, because obviously cell phones did not exist.
Yeah.
That number in 2017, which is on the basis of the last census that we had, is 98%.
Wow. Everyone.
8% of all households, rural, urban, the difference is minimal between the two.
Yeah.
So 98% of all households get information, broadly defined, as news, as totke, as recipes, as whatever you want to call it, get their information from cell phones, right? Nearly 70% of all adults in Pakistan have access to mobile broadband, and they're consuming information off it. Now, the type and nature of that info varies drastically. I'm using it to consume YouTube vlogs and podcasts. Someone else might be using it to consume, food recipes or whatever it is. And the third person might be using it to consume religious evangelical messages, right?
Yeah.
But that's how the message gets out.
Which really raises a huge amount of concern about the nature and the positioning of the information that people are consuming, and how aware you are of those factors that are driving it. Like with TV, it could be, does a channel have a lean towards the left?
Exactly.
Or right?
Yeah.
How sensationalist do they want to be with regards to their lean, and how that affects their ad space? With the internet, nobody realizes that all of this is algorithm based. You are being shown what you want to see, and why is that even wrong?
And there's a fundamental problem here. I mean, it's not a problem. It's actually just a fundamental sort of feature of this entire thing is that it also democratizes religious voice as well, right? To a certain extent, that it allows someone to then sort of share their perspective on what orthodoxy looks like, or share their perspective. And I don't want to sort of turn this into a controversial discussion, but like share their perspective on what blasphemy, for example, sounds like, right? So for me, I think that really is the sea change that's happened as far as religiosity in Pakistan is concerned, and so you have this debate on Twitter every now and then, the Ramadan debate, and all of those sort of really cliched conversations that we. Is Pakistan becoming more religious? This was what Pakistan was like in the 1970s.
Yeah,
I think Pakistan is just consuming more, and religion is just one of those things that it's consuming a lot more of. If Pakistan is consuming footlong shawarmas and Pakistan is consuming zinger biryani, then Pakistan is also consuming religious evangelicals using WhatsApp voice notes and YouTube videos and TikTok and so on.
But Usman, then there's also there is the existing wider issue of Pakistan sort of not being, people not being upwardly mobile, there being a lack of law and order enforcement in the country, which then leads to, people have frustrations. Those frustrations sometimes
explode. So the powder keg theory.
And वो powder keg तो कोई manage कर भी नहीं रहा. All the while then you're told कि जी आपकी country में potential तो बहुत है, because so many people are below this age limit, or potential, and that potential is never converted into anything real. So I don't know what to do.
It is a depressing thought, right? Like, I mean, when you look at the population pyramid, 40% of the population is below the age of 19. Wow. That's an insane statistic, man. That is truly insane. That 40%, like I'm old, like people my age, our age, exactly. People our age are like low double digits हैं पूरे मुल्क पे ना. So 35 and above. I'm 35. So when 35 and above, it's like it's probably like 15%, 20% of the total population is above the age of 35. That's nothing. Just in my cohort, the age cohort of between people between the age of 30 and 35 is like 5% of the population or 6% of the population. So there's really not much there, and there's the sea of like people below the age of 19.
And then like वो क्या करेंगे?
I mean, मैं आपको उसकी एक education से related एक छोटी सी इस पे, I can add like that sort of perspective to it, which is educational attainment has gone up in Pakistan. Okay. So people are it's not gone up dramatically, but there's like a steady increment, right? So
there used to be, I remember in Pakistan several years ago, literacy rate percentage में ना बहुत
so literacy rate चलो एक marker है. It's a whatever for whatever it's worth. I prefer like we prefer to use another marker, which is a percentage of population which is age eligible for an undergrad degree and above unki undergrad degree, right? So 2 decades ago, this figure was like 3% or 4%. Now it's basically, if you look at just the population between 20 and 34, about 12% of the population between the ages of 20 and 34 have an undergrad degree or above, right?
Okay.
That's a pretty significant change
Yeah.
over the course of 2 decades.
Huh.
There are slightly more women in 2020. There are slightly more women between the age of 20 and 34 who have an undergrad degree compared to men. Okay. There are just slightly more women. So that again shows a dramatic change in terms of educational attainment. But this is the catch. The number of women working outside of agriculture, because agriculture में तो women अभी भी काम करती हैं, because a lot of the harder labor in agriculture is done by women. The number of women in remunerated work, so women getting paid for the work that they do, has actually not changed over the last 2 decades. There was about 9
of percentage.
In terms of, it was 9.5% back then. It's still, I think, 9.9% or 9.8% over 20 years, right?
Yeah.
What we're basically seeing is people are getting educated. They're getting educated in higher numbers, but women aren't working, and the kind of work that men are able to do is also not particularly stable. It's not particularly rewarding, and it doesn't necessarily guarantee a means of upward social mobility for them. Sorry, just one last statistic on this. If a person is born in the lowest income quintile in Pakistan, so the bottom 20% of the income distribution, they have less than a 2 in 10 chance of making it to the quintile
above them.
Right? So that is how stagnant the population by and large is as far as social mobility is concerned.
Are there any comparisons? Like, what would a similar country that is like Pakistan but thoda more developing, what should it look like?
So it should be at least so in the most developed, like in the most equal country ever, you would have your probability of moving up would be the same as the probability of a person born in any quintile of the income distribution. Like if a person is born in the topmost quintile, they should have an equal chance of going down as you should have of going up. I think Bangladesh it's higher than this. Because Bangladesh again, the development trajectory has just been sort of, at least the economic growth trajectory has been pretty dramatic over the last 10, 20 years. But Pakistan, the numbers are pretty bleak as far as social mobility is concerned.
And talking about, you said the number of people 40% below 19 and below. Family structures was another thing that you had pointed out as something that has changed significantly over our country's life.
So, I mean, it's changed to the extent that the average household size has shrunk over the 75 years that we've been in existence as a country. Between 98 and 2020 or 98 and 2017, household size has gone down from 6.8 on average, so 6.8 members to one household, to around 6.3. In urban areas, this number has now come under 6, especially in the big cities. Because usually this is tied to nuclearization of families, migration, and better fertility behavior. Right? So people knowing how to use contraceptives, and so on. So fertility rate going down. So एक तो ये family structure में बहुत. So when people say कि the joint family system, which is the great hallmark of Pakistani society or Eastern cultures, is fragmenting, they're true to a certain extent. Yes, joint families are fragmenting simply because the economy of sustaining a joint family no longer exists. There is no large land holding, no big businesses. There are no people have to work and they have to move to find work. But a related statistic which makes it slightly more depressing, and that's where sort of Pakistan being a gender unequal country really comes into sharp light, is that the average age of marriage is not increasing. Usually when you have nuclearization of family structures, greater education for women, greater urbanization, the first thing that you usually see in more gender equal societies is that women get married later on.
Yeah. Because they have jobs, they have stuff to do.
But they have jobs, they are able to exercise choice more freely.
More autonomy.
In the case of Pakistan, the percentage of the population between the age of the female population between 15 and 49, the marriage rate has stayed constant over the last 2 decades, two and a half decades actually. Right? So women are as likely to get married at the same rate as they were pehle. And there's no major change in average age of marriage as well. So women, I think the average age of marriage in Pakistan is around 20 or 21 for women. It's still 20 or 21, even sort of 25 years later. So and that just goes to show, there's a lot of, suppression of women choice that is built into into this particular phenomenon.
So what I'm thinking, if the average age is 20 or 21, that means, sure, there's women getting married at 24, 25, but then there's also women getting married at like 15 or something as well, which is its own bag of sadness. But
basically.
So why though then? Because there's more information technology, there's more proliferation of cell phones and internet phail raha hai, and telecommunication infrastructure is improving. More people are graduates. There are more people.
Sure.
Why has that not changed things for women? Because up to the possibility of not even having to go out to work is increasing, right? You can do stuff from home. I don't know, assume theoretically. Has that had no impact? Is it? I don't think there's like a conscious effort, like top down, to keep women suppressed.
No, I think there's a conscious effort to keep women.
Oh, great.
I mean, by top down, I'm not necessarily talking about the state. Although the state also, makes sure that it leaves no stone unturned as far as suppressing female mobility in Pakistan is concerned. But when I say top down, I think so. Here's a way of thinking about it, right? That who loses out the most if women start exercising choice?
Men.
It's men, right? It's like men who were used to, if in really evolutionary terms, it's men who were used to getting married off without ever having to do anything for themselves. It's men who didn't have to compete with half the population for a job because women weren't allowed to work. It's men who weren't allowed to compete with women who are more educated than them for the same jobs, right? So remember, now women and men have similar levels of higher education attainment, but those women are just are not showing up in the labor force. So men have like a hall pass as far as getting all of those jobs are concerned, right? So there's this great piece by Haris Gazdar where he basically talks about patriarchy as collective action by men. So collective action meaning men getting together and deciding that these are the interests that they want to protect. And there's a lot of research now that increasingly shows that at the level of the household, suppressing women's mobility is a conscious decision that is taken by male members of the household, right? And that is largely designed to protect the privileges that men have in a struggling economy, or to protect the privileges that men have in an economy that doesn't have a lot out there in the first place, right?
Right.
So I do think that there is a conscious, but then you also have the role of culture, right? And then you have the role of internalized ideas about the private realm and women being sort of remaining within those within those boundaries. But I feel that if despite the prevalence of information technology, despite the prevalence of women having access to new sources of information, the fact is that their day-to-day lives are still heavily mediated by male members of the household, and so exercising choice like that is difficult. What we can't say for sure at this point is if there is some unforeseen gender revolution happening in this country, where women at home are innovating or have found sources of income or have found ways to escape the patriarchal trap that they normally otherwise exist in, right? वो उसके effects हमें most likely we'll find out 10, maybe 15 years down the line. It's not apparent at this stage, at least.
What would that look like?
So I think one would be the Bangladesh way, right? Which is simply that the economy needs labor to grow, and women are always a source of cheap labor. You can underpay women and they work. That's what happened in Korea. That's what happened in Taiwan. That's what happened in Bangladesh, because you can force them to work, right?
That framing makes it sound like a marketing technique. Bro, ye kar lo, paise
It's like there's violence associated with it, right? Like you can discipline women and get them to work in factories for lower wage than men, and oftentimes उनकी मजबूरियां हैं तो इसलिए ये होता है. One way is this, that there might be some gender revolution in this country which looks a bit like this. The other is if it happens more insidiously. By insidiously, I mean like if it happens behind sort of closed doors, which is partly what's happened in a place like Iran, for example, right? Okay. Where women were able to exercise sociability with other women through like local community groups, through the internet, through cell phones, through just generally sort of having greater access to sources of communication, and being able to build support groups then being able to sort of enter the economy as small entrepreneurs, small business owners, home-based workers, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Again, that is one route that is possible. अब हमें नहीं पता कि ये actually होता है नहीं, but this is.
We should get Soul Sisters on this.
I think Soul Sisters is a very good example of a women support group that of female sociability. क्योंकि लॉन्डो के पास क्या है, ठीक है, and लॉन्डो के पास तो snooker cafe भी था. So growing up, I grew up in a suburb of Lahore called Garntown, right? So Garntown was like an upper middle income suburb. हमारे पास स्नूकर कैफे भी था, हमारे पास गेमिंग आर्केड भी था, हमारे पास लोकल जो है वो जनरल स्टोर भी था, क्रिकेट वाला ग्राउंड भी था, हमारे पास एक स्कूल और एक पोस्ट स्कूल जिंदगी थी जिसमें हम बंक मार के कुछ कर सकते थे, राइट. खवातीन की तो मोबिलिटी पूरी पुलिस है ना. तो आपने अगर उनको स्कूल भी भेज दिया, स्कूल से उन्होंने घर आना है, घर से वो कोई बाहर क्रिकेट खेलने तो उन्होंने जाना नहीं, ना उन्होंने मार्केट प्लेस पे जाना है, ना उन्होंने अनसुपरवाइज किसी और पब्लिक स्पेस में जाना है. सो ये इंटरनेट जो है वो शायद सोशबिलिटी का आपको एक प्लेटफॉर्म दे दे, क्योंकि लड़कों के पास तो सोशबिलिटी हमेशा से थी. ये जो पाकिस्तान में, आई मीन दिस इज ऑब्वियसली समथिंग दैट everyone is aware of to a certain extent. They live it. So, this idea of the boys, right? The boys culture, like boys finding time. It's a product of this side of sociability that men grow up with, right? In Pakistan, which is largely because of the kind of mobility that they have access to. So maybe and I've seen, by the way, it's not Soul Sisters, stratified by urban upper middle income groups, but I've seen these kind of groups emerge on the internet. In more middle class localities as well. Okay. The sociability that comes with, say, the local beauty parlor. Right. Teen run होता है, उसमें खवातीन customers होती हैं, that becomes a site. So I have this friend who's a sociologist and teaches in the US at Lewis and Clark College, Sidra Kamran. She works on women who worked in all women economic spaces. So like Meena Bazaar in Karachi, beauty parlors. वहाँ पे औरतों की सोशबिलिटी के लिए कुछ आपको जगह मिल जाती हैं, बट वो बहुत लिमिटेड हैं, so one hopes that those would grow.
अच्छा, तो now to get to the forced optimism, based on all your studies and research and सब कुछ, we've painted a very amazingly bleak picture of Pakistan's performance over the past 75 years, and there are no, for the mass consumer like me, there are no perhaps super obvious points of optimism that shayad agar ye ho jaye to there will be like a big improvement. Has there been anything that you've seen? If you say no, it'll be hilarious.
No. So I really didn't want this to be like a complete sort of buzzkill sort of conversation in the first place, but I feel like some things have improved, like some things have tangibly improved. This idea of gaining access to education, I mean, education is worth, I mean, मैं तो कहूँगा because I have a vested interest in saying this, but like education is worth attaining for its own use, right? Like education is an end in and of itself in some ways, right? So kids, continue getting an education to keep me in a job. But that certainly, I think that's a significant change, right? Like this is one of my gripes with people who used to share those pictures of what Purana Pakistan looks like. When they say, oh, there's those women who used to wear sarees in these universities. Yeah, exactly. But those universities were only accessible to a very small percentage of the population, right? And now, if it means that you have guys and girls who are coming in from like lower middle income or rural backgrounds to these places, and they're more conservative and whatever, but they're now gaining access to something, right? So I think that's a pretty significant change. We've had changes, we've had some improvements in health indicators. I know we're looking at straws here, but like maternal mortality rates, childbirth की neonatal fertility, इस तरह की चीजें जो हैं, they've all improved.
Okay.
Substantively, but they could have improved a lot more. Obviously, there's always space for that, especially when you compare it to places like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. So I think those things are reasonably, they're reasonably robust in some ways. But then so other than that, if you're asking, KJ, what do I find as a source of optimism? I don't want to sort of classify this as a sort of conversation in terms of what will, if X falls into place, then all of this is going to happen.
Yeah.
I think a lot of things we've already shown progress on, but the progress isn't immediately visible, right?
Right.
So like अभी इस वक्त our politics is whatever bitter, polarized, ये सब कुछ है. But there are certain types of things that have happened in our politics which are relatively which are they're cause of optimism, right? So for example, the politicians competing on the fact that हम बेहतर हैं इनसे on some developmental metric कि जब हम आए थे तो यार हमने ये देखो ये चीजें बनाई, वो कह रहे हैं नहीं यार हम आए थे तो हमने ये चीजें बनाई, right? आज से 20 साल पहले ये बातें भी नहीं हो, मुझे नहीं पता कि
नहीं थी.
So some sense of competition invokes some idea of welfare, right? Here, simply the fact that there are just too many people in this country is in itself something that politicians can't ignore, right? Like if politicians have to stay in a job, they have to deliver on something. So that really keeps me going as far as like finding some source of optimism is concerned. कि कुछ तो करना पड़ता है आपको, like कुछ ना कुछ करना पड़ता है. आज से 90s में BISP, सेहत कार्ड, पब्लिक ट्रांसपोर्ट के बारे में कोई सोच भी नहीं रहा था. Like लोगों ने किसी ने, I don't know if you ever saw that video, someone shared this video of Lahore from the 1980s. Okay, oh, look at how green and peaceful Lahore is, right? Like and the only thing I could think of when I looked at it was like I couldn't see a single single type of public transport. Like कोई बस नहीं, कोई वैन नहीं, कुछ नहीं नजर आ रहा. ठीक है, सिर्फ गाड़ियां हैं जो सारे ट्रैफिक रूल्स तोड़ रही हैं. सो लाइक हर बंदा जो है वो गोल चक्कर से उठा आ रहा है, कोई रॉन्ग वे जा रहा है. ठीक है. And I'm like, at least now there's a conversation happening around the fact that people should be allowed to commute, and the government has some job in, like, has a responsibility in giving it, right?
Yeah.
So these are, again, I'm clutching at straws to a large extent. These are things that are somewhat tangible, and people are going to sort of, people are going to sort of obviously, build on these. And then the last thing is that people have been holding politicians accountable for at least the last 15 years in some form or the other, right? And I think that accountability is not just based on the fact कि हमें आपने जो है वो आते साथ ही जो है वो हमें हमारे मोहल्ले को आपने पाइप नहीं डाल दिया या आपने बिजली नहीं दी या ये नहीं. There are other sort of grander ideas as part of that accountability as well, right? So why did you strike a deal with the establishment? Why did you sort of negate on, why did you sort of not fulfill all of those other promises, for example, that you may have made, right? These are things that are harder to reverse. I think they've become part of like a political psyche, political culture in a very young country. So that idea of accountability is something that I feel can only be strengthened going forward. But a large part of that rests on how our politicians behave, how political parties engage with young people in particular, and so let's see what happens after that.
Would it be counterproductive if I asked you like your top 3 causes for concern in Pakistan? Like if you had it, like would that put a damper on this optimism that we've just
heard? My biggest cause of concern is and I mean I don't want to sound like a cookie cutter sort of male ally type, but my biggest cause of concern is simply the collective action known as patriarchy in this country. Not just obviously from a utilitarian, we're keeping out educated women from the workforce, but like literally from just a humanistic perspective, gender ke hawale se, it's a real, a shit show. I don't know if I can sort of say that on this pod, but it's a shit show, and it's something that I don't see like a lot of progress on in the last two and a half decades, right? The second is obviously the ecological crisis, the way that our cities have grown, the way that the state in particular, the military establishment, as well as sort of private developers have, literally ravaged the urban fabric by sort of, eating into rural areas, eating into fertile, agricultural land and building housing societies for essentially investment. So my wife works exactly on this. And so she's obviously a much better person to talk about it, but like the scale at which this has happened is we've set ourselves for a climate catastrophe, over the next 10-15 years. And the third is, I think just the regional situation, like the fact that things that aren't in Pakistan's control, the rise of Modi in India, and just generally being in a neighborhood that's volatile. Part of it is obviously Pakistan's own ungal in the region and how it sort of operates. Part of it has to do with the fact that things are out of our control and really there's no pathway to normalcy for this region in general, right? Iran के अपने मसले चल रहे हैं, otherwise सोचो कितना पाकिस्तान के लिए आसान हो कि if Iran had a particular type of relationship with the rest of the world. Pakistan can import gas from Iran. Pakistan could have free trade with India. There are things that are economically, culturally connected across these two countries.
Yeah.
So just the fact of being in a region that's not stable doesn't give me much cause for optimism.
Great. I love to end it on points like these. Before we do end it, I'll sneak in quickly. I don't know if you're aware, but this is something we asked. Do you have any Jinn stories?
Oh, do I have any Jinn stories?
It's okay.
Yeah, I actually do have.
Great, very good.
It's not a Jinn story. It's a story that it's a personal story.
Okay.
It's a story that doesn't reflect particularly well on my parents. And fortunately, my dad isn't here anymore amongst us to defend himself. My mother, I hope, never listens to this podcast.
Yeah. No, I'll send it to her.
But especially since my mom had an orthodox religious turn later on in her life, so she's since then really she's washed her hands away from all Jinn related concerns.
Acha.
I was like maybe 8 years old. My father was unwell at the time. He had pancreatitis, so he had to have like a procedure done, and he was getting conflicting medical advice.
Right.
So I have lots of doctors in my family, and so there was like a divide in the family doctor camp as well. What kind of procedure he should go for, and it was interfering in like some of his work schedule and all of that. So they were at a complete loss कि इसका अब हम क्या solution निकालें. And so someone like my father's colleague recommended that he speak to this gentleman who had access to the to the realm of the unknown.
Yeah.
And this gentleman lived in a suburb very close to where we were. And so my father went and met him. And he told my father that did you have any kids? And my dad was like, yeah, I have 3. I have 2 daughters who, and a son, and the son is the youngest one. And he's like, how old is your son? He's like, he's 8. And so he was like, okay, you come see me again and bring your son with you. ठीक है अच्छा अब ये कोई human sacrifice type situation थोड़ी सी
I was thinking
thankfully not like that ठीक है so उन्होंने मुझे एक ड्राइंग रूम में बिठा दिया very typical पाकिस्तानी ड्राइंग रूम ठीक है उसमें हम बैठे में कारपेट के ऊपर सारे बड़े सोफे बैठे मुझे उन्होंने कारपेट पे बिठा दिया right in the middle of the and then the uncle goes out and he brings like a little like a lamp like a diya ठीक है so and he lights a flame in it. And then he starts saying some sort of religious incantation that obviously I have no recollection of. And then he asks me to look into the flame. Right. Okay? And he says, "Tumhe Baba nazar aa rahe? Do you see the figure in the flame?" अच्छा अब मैं 8 साल का था मेरी ठीक है I don't know मेरी मेमोरी क्या है नहीं है ये वो लेकिन मुझे बहुत क्लियरली याद है कि मुझे कुछ नजर नहीं आ रहा था उस फ्लेम ठीक है मुझे कुछ नजर नहीं आ रहा था उस फ्लेम में लेकिन मुझे लग रहा है मेरे पे बहुत प्रेशर है कुछ देखने का उसमें राइट तो मेरे पे बहुत ज्यादा प्रेशर था क्योंकि एक मेरे पे अब आगे उन्होंने मुझसे कहा कि आप बाबा क्या कह रहे हैं कि ये फलां ऑपरेशन कराना चाहिए या ये वाला ऑपरेशन कराना चाहिए and I'm looking into the flame I don't see jack all I see is like a flame ठीक है and then I give a response to the fact whatever the faculties of an 8-year-old at that time was I gave a response I was like I think my dad should go for option A which was to get like this procedure done a certain way uske baad the uncle was just really happy like this had happened right like he felt that I had formed a direct connection and this 8-year-old child is pure of spirit अब उनको नहीं पता था कि मैं actually बिल्कुल मुझे कुछ नजर नहीं आया अब उनको लगा कि ये कनेक्शन इतना इस वक्त मजबूत चल रहा है उन्होंने कमरे से अपने 2-3 रिश्तेदार बुलाए उनमें से एक का पासपोर्ट गुमा हुआ था ठीक है तो मुझे कहते हैं बाबा जी से पूछो कि इनका पासपोर्ट किधर है अब मैं देख रहा हूँ कह रहा हूँ यार इतनी कम्युनिकेशन नहीं है मेरी कि मैं उनको बता सकूं कि वो पासपोर्ट उनका किधर है but yeah so it ended up with like him saying okay they last kept the passport in a chest of drawers and I responded go look in the chest of drawers again it's probably there right that was the signal that I got from the flame this is what happened to me when I was 8 here's the kicker my parents have no recollection of this happening
the whole event What?
So as an older, much more rational adult, one day I confronted my parents and I was like, what the fuck was that? Like,
Wait,
why
did your dad get the operation? That
yeah, he got the procedure and it was fine and everything sort of went okay. I don't know if I don't know. I think he didn't listen to me.
Yeah.
He went with one camp of the sort of the medical advice that he was getting. But like many years later, I basically asked my parents, I was like, why, what were you thinking? Like, and I hope you didn't base the decision on what I was, because I couldn't see anything. I was just making shit up. I was 8 years old. And they were like, we don't remember this happening. And I was like, no, I'm pretty sure it happened. It was a house in Faisal Town. I'd forgotten the name of the uncle. And they tried to get me to find his, niece's lost passport as well.
Yeah.
And they were like, nahi, ye to nahi hua. You're badi vivid imagination है तुम्हारी as an 8-year-old.
Wow, full gaslighting.
Full gaslighting. और वो भी पता है वो gaslighting, अब मुझे यकीन है, मेरे parents जैसे otherwise they're very rational people. मुझे यकीन है कि they're just embarrassed to admit that they took me to some Baba and tried to get me to form a connection with the other realm through a flame. But this was my this is the major encounter that I've had with.
We've heard quite a few similar stories, but we've never heard anything in this realm. Good stories, some stories line up. There's always like a gadha jiski gardan lambi ho jati hai or something like that. So many people have met that one gadha. But this is great. I especially love how he tried to get like a bonus.
He was like, signal strong.
Amazing.
So yeah.
Chale, theek hai. I will link any articles that you want. I think the food and culture wala makes sense. Any others that we might have talked about that might be relevant for you? I'll link your like bibliography on Dawn.
So the two that I'm proud of, at least on as far as the discussion that we've had today, is the one on the food thing, how diets have changed, and the other is this article titled "Moral Panic" when our former prime minister was talking a lot about divorce rates and the family system breaking apart. It just doesn't show up in the numbers the way that he's saying it is. But that's something that I think everyone should at least sort of,
Like I threatened you before, once you've done one, now you're part of the roster.
Yeah, I'd be more than happy to be back.
So you'll be back.
All right, great.
Yeah, I think I've tried to avoid talking about Pakistan for a long time because one of the reasons is Rizwan lives in Lahore and usko bahut tension.
Yeah.
Okay, bro, मैं गायब हो जाऊंगा.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
All you people live abroad. एक दिन Rizwan Palvisha का photography business will be shut.
No. Yeah, I think that's a fair fear to have if you're in Pakistan.
But also, I think this is good to give people like, अच्छा bro, numbers तो ये कह रहे हैं ना, your feelings are अपनी जगह, but like numbers तो ये कह रहे हैं. ठीक है जी, thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. And I don't know if this made sense to people.
No, it made a lot of sense. I had a lot of fun talking about it. I feel like a lot of these things I've been sort of looking at numbers that I've had for a very long time. Yeah. But I just didn't have. There was never one conversation.
I'm going to put the most clickbaity chapter titles for each of these sections. How Pakistan's economy died, why we hate women, whatever. ताकि सुन ले लो. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Stop recording.
Yeah.